Today we're going to dive deep into neck contouring. First, I want to give you a state of the jig address. Here's the update on the neck hold down that is designed to work with the Maxim Guitar Works sanding blocks, whether you're using it with the air sander attachment or whether you're using it manual. This apparatus will hold that neck with clamping power on either side and slippery plastic guides on either side for a perfect fit and allow it to slide back and forth with ease. Holding it down to your workbench while the neck is being held down by the jig and allowing you to do perfect inline radiuses is going to be a key to success for a lot of you folks. This is not the final jig though. I've got it, I'm testing it, it's working very well, but I want to beef it up a little bit more. And so I've got a couple ideas. I've got some additional parts and hardware on order. And hopefully very shortly, this will be ready for prime time. So now let's get going with part 6 of the 15-part series of the premier Strat style guitar build. This is modeled after the Strat style lessons that I do at the local community college when I'm instructing students in person. Contouring a neck is probably one of the scariest parts that you will do if you've never built a guitar before. And truly, there's a lot that can go wrong with it. So it's okay to be a little bit nervous about this, but you have to approach it from a very analytical, a very structured process to achieve success. It turns out that only 23% of all people who build guitars actually make their own necks. And I just made that figure up. But of that 23% that I just made up, there's probably only 10% of those that actually do a really, really good job. And I made that number up too. The point is, it's a challenging process. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but it's going to take time to learn. I highly suggest that you build multiple necks before you build your dream guitar, because it's going to take a while to hone in your skills. All right, when you're talking about building a neck, in today's world, you really have 3 different ways. You can build it totally on a CNC. That doesn't make it easy. It just gives you the ability to do multiple ones with absolute repeatability. All right? Not all of you are going to be in the place where you have or plan to have a CNC. So you can't rely on that. Now, there are a lot of you, more and more every day, that are getting into the CNC world, and I applaud you for that, because it's really can open up whole new doorways to things that you want to do. And maybe at some point in the future, I will do a series specifically talking about CNC guitar building, from all the way to designing, to hold down fixtures, to cutters to use, to speeds and feeds, and to the final execution of that. But that's for the future, that's not for today. Now you can also use jigs, all right? But jigs require some level of skill in order to design, and a lot of trial and error to get them perfected. And you can look back in my old videos, look into the past. Actually the first guitar making video I ever did was on a neck shaping jig that I built years ago. And I still use that occasionally. It is a great, great tool, but that's not the subject for today either, because not all of you are going to have access to the jig like that or be able to build a jig like that. Today we're talking about the first way you should ever build a guitar neck, and that is doing the contouring by hand with different tools and other jigs to kind of help you with that. A more simple approach as far as cost-wise, but it takes an element of skill. But this skill is mandatory. Even if you're going to move into the CNC world, you really need to know how to build it by hand. I require my students to always do hand shaping, at least on their first guitar for sure, so that they understand the processes and how to do it, and then can apply it to the CNC world or building a jig or what have you. Now, hopefully everyone has got the documents of this build that I have offered in every single episode I've done. Okay, it goes over the parts list, task by episode, and a little sheet on how what we're going to do and areas to take notes for your own records. If you're not taking notes and keeping track of specifications and successes and failures and things like that, then you're not really learning as much as you could potentially learn from the experience of building. So remember, if you want those documents, you have to email me at info@maximumguitarworks.com. I think most people that want them probably already have them at this point because the requests are beginning to slow down. But I want you to know, even if you're jumping into this series midstream, you may want to request these documents and go back to the beginning and watch everything in sequential order. Now don't worry, we're going to go over everything in detail, but this is the combination of things that we're going to use right here. I've got a neck hold down jig that's going to allow me to work on that neck for creating the angle that I need on the taper, I should say, on the back of the neck. I'm going to use a little grinding tool to do some transition areas. I'm going to use this simple jig right here in order to hold the neck while I hand shape it with tools. Okay, I'm not going to use my sanding blocks, but I'm going to show you how you could use those or what they could be used for if you choose to. A lot of sandpaper, a lot of sanding tools that are round, that are contoured, that are blocky, a lot of gauges, different types of checking out the profile, and I've got different rasps and files, and this is my number one tool right there. That is a little skinny sander for working on that neck. So all of this, plus probably a few things that I haven't gotten out because I haven't thought about it yet, are things we're going to use to shape the neck. So it's really, I mean, I guess if you want to simplify it, you could take a single rasp and do it, but you do need ways to hold down the neck to better support it, and you do need ways that create advantages for your success. And all of this is very attainable with very minimal tools that are actually required and jigs that you can build yourself. So this is a good way to kind of get into guitar making and to do your first neck contour. I find it easier to do step one before you do step two. So that's where I'm going to start with step one. Now we've got to figure out where the contouring is going to happen and where the flat areas are going to be on this neck. That gives us the definition of where the transition areas are going to be between the contour and the flat areas. Now typically what you'll find on the standard bolt-on neck pocket is you'll find the pocket is about 3 inches, and we're looking, we're talking about Fender style guitars here. So I can take and I can draw a line that is 3 inches from the end of the heel, but honestly, I like to add just a little bit more for safekeeping. So I'm going to make that at 3 1/4 inches. And I'm going to draw a line, and that represents basically a 1/4 inch forward of where my neck pocket will end. And that is a do not exceed line for me. Now the transition area from that can look like anything. I mean, you can parallel the neck pocket. You can use a jig like this that allows you to draw that very traditional shape on a Fender heel. I prefer to use a more high-tech method to define that transition area, and it's called the inner diameter of a roll of tape. I am going to place this so it is centered on that block of wood where my 3 1/4 inch line intersects with the edges, and I'm going to draw this and draw a little extra dark for you so it's easier to see. And I'm going to do something that looks a little bit more like this. It doesn't really matter what it looks like, and you can create your own template so you can quickly and easily trace it out every time that you do your style. But I like to make it so it flows very well. What I want to know is where the center line is, and I want to also know where the beginning of the nut is. And I'll just estimate it by drawing a line from the underside. I'll show you close up here in a second, but once I identify those areas, to me, that's where the apex of my curve is going to be, is where those two intersect, and I am just going to freehand a line that takes the last curve on these sides and blends those curves to that point. And let me do that real quick and I'll show you. All right, so if you look at that, I've basically taken these curves and continued those curves so they meet up in the center, and then I can round that over. Now that's a little bit too pointy for me. I like it to fit in the curvature of my hand a little bit better. So I'm going to make that even more round. Now if you look at that second line, where I rounded it off even more, that is going to be what I'm looking for. Here's your close-up, and again, it is personal preference. There is no really engineering aspect to it, other than the design that you like, and maybe in this one a little bit of comfort where the web of your thumb to index finger come in, and you want to make that comfortable. And again here, I just like the nice rounded look to it. I think that finishes it off nicely, and I do that even on the CNC style because I just think it just blends very well. Now once we have the transition areas identified, that tells us where we're going to do the contour. The transition areas can be a very mild taper, or they can be a little bit more dramatic. I prefer to do mine with a more dramatic curve effect because I feel like it just looks outstanding. It looks tight. And I find it to be comfortable too because it keeps the taper for a further distance, so I get that same consistent feel as I'm working my way up the neck. And remember, the reason why all of this stuff is so important is because to a player, the neck will tell you more about the guitar than anything else, because that is what your body is physically connecting to more than anything, and that is the palm of your hand and how that feels as it works up and down on that neck. One of the things you're going to have to figure out is what are going to be the dimensions. Now, the templates that I've worked on here, and if you've purchased my template sets, thank you. And you will end up with the very same dimensions as what I have here. It's just a little bit over the standard 1 and 11/16, giving us a little bit of room for sanding. And now what you should be at is perfectly 1 inch here and 1 inch there. The most common neck profile has some sort of taper that goes down. Now that taper is generally gauged between the 12th fret and the 1st fret. But it continues all the way up to your transition area. So in my case, I prefer a taper of around 2.5 to 3 millimeters difference. So thinner on the 1st fret by that much than here. But I like a kind of full neck design too. So typically I'll be looking at around the 12th fret, maybe around 23.5 millimeters, somewhere in that range. And then down here, I'm looking for, let's say, 21 millimeters, okay? So 21 to 23.5 would give me about 2.5 millimeters of taper along there. And that's what I'm looking for. You can certainly begin carving away this neck and keep measuring and get it to be right around that taper that you would like, 2-3 millimeters, wherever. But I'm telling you, that is extremely difficult to do it freehand and get a perfectly straight and consistent taper. It will make your job so much more challenging than if we could create this taper with another tool that guarantees us consistency in that taper. It just so happens I have the tool for that, and that's right here. Okay, this is something called a safe T-planer. It's not a safety planer. You can get hurt, but it's not really as scary as what some people really think. I have students that refuse to use it because they're intimidated by it, but it is not that scary. The thing is you have to have control of the neck and the wood that you're passing underneath of this in a drill press, and that is what makes it to be easy. if you don't have proper control and your hands aren't away and out of harm's way, then it can be a dangerous tool. But what we can do is set this up on a drill press. We can impose a 2.5 millimeter angle to this, 2.5 to 3 millimeters, and we can work it back and forth, and then take the table up a little higher and work it back and forth again, and we can put the taper into the neck. And that's the first thing that we're going to do, is identify that taper. As far as the setup, how do we hold on to it? This is where a jig that I've made comes into play. I have a jig that has two auto clamping mechanisms on the side. I've got a top piece that has the radius in a negative all dished out, because when we're at this point, we've already got the frets installed, we already got the radius done, and I want something that I can lay on there that is going to be flat and it's going to be stable. And so I've already dished that out and put it on top of this board. And this board is simply just hinged on one side, and inside of this I have a piece of MDF that has created that same taper that we talked about. So it's going to create about a 2.5 to 3 millimeter taper, somewhere in that range. So once this tapered piece of MDF drops into place, and I lower this down, it copies that angle, and now I can place this on top and make sure I have it placed such that I'm staying clear of my transition areas. So I can have one here, I can have one down here, holding it down on each side, and now that just created an area that I can work, and I can stay perfectly tapered along that. Let's stop talking about it and let's go do it, shall we? Now here's a couple setup tips for you with a safety planer. Number one, I found that if I take the safety planer and fully insert it into the chuck and tighten it down, there's less chance of the safety planer, due to pressure, shifting up into the chuck further. It can't go any further, and I get more accuracy out of using it that way. The other thing is I raised my table up to that point. Now, you could certainly lower the quill and then lock the quill down, and you could use it with that type of adjustment. And I may do it from this point on that way, but if your quill doesn't have a good locking mechanism on it, you can just keep raising the table slowly to get it closer to that. Now, what you'll see right now, if I go down to the heel transition area, I've got full clearance right here on the heel side, but as I work my way up about the halfway point, I begin to make contact with that little shelf that's underneath outside of the cutters, okay? So right there. So that is a good starting point for us to be. Now, the way I designed this jig is these big blocks help elevate the clamps to keep it nice here, but it also gives you something to hold on to. Like I said, the key is that you need to have this under control and your hands away from that. All right, that is the safest way to use the safety planer. All right, and then once we start going through, we're going to pass back and forth. This is going to be spinning around. It's going to take cuts each pass, and I'm going to probably overlap by maybe 10 or 20% and work my way up depending upon how it feels. Now, I have found somewhere around 1,500 RPMs to be very smooth. The directions say 2,500 to 3,000. All right, so I ended up running about 2,200 RPMs. That did feel pretty smooth. So we've got now a perfect taper in there that is approximately 2.5 to 3 millimeters. And if we take this off and do our measurements, again, we were shooting for about 21 and about 23.5, somewhere around there. And obviously, we're going to take a little tiny bit more off in the sanding process, but here's the key. You don't want to take off very much. Okay, so you really need to get pretty close to your final specification that you want to be. In this particular case, if we go back and look at it, at the 12th fret area, I've got 23.6, very close. And over at the 1st fret area, I have got 20.95, so right at 21. So this will allow me to get a taper that I want and a consistency to that taper. Now what I'm going to do is get my center finding rule, and I am going to find the dead center, and now we're going to connect those lines. I was basically measuring how much I was removing from that lip, starting with 25 point something millimeters and going down to around 21 millimeters. I could do the math and figure out how much I needed to remove at that point. In the end, the taper is kind of controlling it, so this ends up being what it is, and because the taper is where I set it, it produces what I want. So I don't really need to measure both sides as I'm going along. And you can see I kept the distance from the transition areas, and you've got to plan that based upon if your transition is going to be dramatic or it's going to be gradual. Mine's going to be more dramatic, therefore I can get a little bit closer to that point, and that will be good. Now the center line right over here is what we are going to refer to as a do not touch. No touchy! This center line is the only mechanism that we have to ensure that we maintain a constant angle taper here. Again, the taper can be whatever you want it to be, but it needs to be constant. It can't be wavy like this, and if you try to freehand it, it will be that way, trust me, unless you're really good. So the next step is to draw parallel lines. Now this is only a technique. You don't have to do this. You could go at freehand and start curving one side at a time, and you could compare it against jigs such as this that give you an idea of when you're getting close to that dimension. You could also use a device like this, a contour device, which allows you to do it one direction, flip it around backwards, and put it back on there and see if you're a mirror image of each other. So that's another tool that will come into handy. But one technique is to work this off in facets. Okay, so we could take, and you could take measurements and you could do whatever you wanted to do, but let me just freehand this one, and I'm going to make a facet here and the same facet over there, and it's very facetnating. And I'm going to do the same thing on the edge and on the other edge. And now I have an area that I can just begin to start chipping away at this. And then I'll end up doing ones that are halfway in between those two, and that could be my next facet. And then another facet in between those two. All right, now I've built out a segment of lines where I could facet from one to the other and then do the next facet, and all of a sudden if you do enough facets, you'll connect those together and you'll have your classic C shape. And then you'll do some final sanding and such like that. But that's going to be a reference point for me to start, but I'm just going to start hitting it hard. So the next thing we got to talk about is how we are going to do that. I would not recommend taking your Shinto, yeah, I think I said it right that time. Shinto rasp and begin holding it in your hand and working it like that, that is not a recipe for success. What you need to do is be able to clamp this down. And we could use the same jig right here and put this in and hold it down and begin working that, but that doesn't really give you the access that you need. You need something with a little bit more access. So what I've built for this specific purpose is this guy right here. Now, this is just two 1-inch pieces of MDF, maybe it was 3/4, two 3/4-inch pieces of MDF. So it made it 1.5 inches in width. And I made this basic shape. All right, so it comes up to like a T, it comes out, and then it's got a place for the fretboard that's right inside there with a little space for clamping action on either side. And this is how we're going to hold the neck down. Now, this top piece is, again, curved to be the radius. Now, I use multiple radius, so I didn't set it to, I don't have one of these for every single different radius that I do. What I did is set it for about 12-inch radius, and that's kind of splitting the difference and be in the middle, and it will support the fretboard side of the neck perfectly well in no matter what you're doing. So when you create that negative, you can do it on a CNC, but as we talked about, if you don't have a CNC, how do you create that perfect radius? There's an easy way and there's a hard way. There's a cheap way and an expensive way. In this particular case, the expensive way is not always the best way. You could buy one of my radius sanding blocks set to whatever radius you want, and then you could take that to the table saw and you could slice off the edges and then slice off the top, and you are left with a radius, perfect radius block that then gets mounted to the top of your piece of wood that you're going to be clamping to your workbench. And now that gives you the radius that you need for your neck to fit perfectly and be properly supported. Now, I use a little piece of leather in there to give it a little bit of cushion. So since my frets are already installed, the frets will sink into it a little bit and it'll be nice and stable. That's the expensive way. Really, I mean, there's no need to basically destroy a perfectly good radius sanding block in order to create that. What you can do is take your radius sanding block and take a piece of whatever 1/2-inch MDF, and you can then put your nice grit, whatever, 60, 80 grit paper, and you can work that back and forth, and you can create a mock fretboard. That's really easy to do in MDF. Then you take sandpaper to that mock fretboard and put sandpaper on that and go to another piece of MDF and sand that, and that basically puts the radius in there. So there's a couple steps, there's a little bit of exercise involved, and for many of us that might be a good thing, but it's pretty inexpensive. That way you're not chopping up your radius block to do that if you're not CNC capable. Okay, first thing you want to do is take whatever mounting jig that you created and put it in a vise. And I like to set it to a height that is going to be comfortable, ergonomic, for the work that I'm going to be doing. So you need to do that. Now, if you don't have a cool vise that can actually take an entire block like this and mount it, then you could certainly just bolt it to the side of your workbench, and that will be your spot to always do this activity. You can bolt it, unbolt it as needed. So that might be an idea for you. Next thing you want to do is when you get it set it up is you want to take a level and make sure that this is perfectly level. Okay. You guys were buying that? You guys are so gullible. Doesn't matter if it's level, okay? Because we've already made sure that that taper is perfectly what we need it to be. But what we do need is we need to clamp this down. So because I've got these notches on either side for a very specific reason here, I need to fill those notches where the fretboard is gapped with a little block of wood that just fits in there nicely. And then we're going to clamp the back also. Now this is going to take a lot of time. I'm going to show you the techniques and we're just going to speed through it. But a lot of these rasps, I really love these dragon files to use those. I've also got one with a little you know, kind of radius to it that I like. But the one I really like to start off with is the Shinto rasp. It just is most aggressive, and because it's flat, it'll help you keep the curvature a little flatter than otherwise. But again, the important thing is the center line we do not touch. So we leave that as our reference for everything else to follow. And at this point, we're just going to work back and forth. Some of these rasps have a nice little handle on the front. That might have been a good investment for me. Okay, I've got my first facet in there. Now what I can do is I can do the next facet, which is going to connect from the center of the facet I just created to the next line over. And I can use that as now a reference. And then we'll go that to the next one down this way. Now we'll take halfway through that facet up towards the next one, which is going to be passed, so in between those two. We're working our way to the center line. Now, the one thing I didn't mention earlier, and you might want a line for this, but about 1/8 of an inch from the bottom of the fretboard, you want to put a line that is a do not exceed line. You want to leave yourself 1/8 of an inch for final sanding. And without rolling up onto the fretboard, you certainly don't want to take the fretboard with the rasps. So now, I'm going to go from that line basically up to this other midline and work my way down. All right, everything we've been doing so far has been fascinating. Fascinating. Yeah, you get it. This has been a great tool for creating all of the linear facets that we just did as we worked our way around. Now it's time to shift modes, and we are going to move up to a coarse dragon rasp. Now I'm going to use this one here. It's got a flat edge on one side, round on the other, and I'm going to take the flat edge and I'm going to start connecting all of these facets together, but do not exceed that line at the bottom that's, whatever, a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch away from the fretboard, and do not cut into this center line. You want to stop just short, but as close as you can, and complete the rounding process. This is a time that you can really control between a D-shaped neck and a C-shaped neck. I've basically, by removing all of the facets, I have more of a D shape because there's a big flat spot on the top. And I'm going to keep it this way until I would do the other side. And then I'm going to blend them both together in a way that produces symmetry that is going to be more C-shaped. And I'm going to get all the way up to that line as close as I possibly can. Now I'm also going to go down to the fine dragon rasp, and that'll remove a lot of the scratch marks and get us ready for about 80 grit sanding. All right, number one, you'll notice I did not touch that center line. See how close I am? Maybe an eighth, a little bit more than an eighth away, but I did not touch the center line. And on the side, I started getting really close, about 16 inch to an eighth of an inch away, and that's as close as I need to be because the sanding process will take it and then blend in those edges. But right now, all I'm at is a D, maybe a little bit of a C shape, but I've got a pretty good contour on there. Now normally at this point in time, I will take this neck, I will flip it around the other direction so I have the outside edge so I can easily work on the other side, and I will match that contour on the opposite side. Okay, we're not going to spend all the time in this video going through that. I'm just showing one side as an example. So we've got that one side set up nice. I got a shape that I'm really comfortable with. Once I do the other side, I can put it in my hand and I can feel if it's the shape that I want, but we know it's not changing the thickness specifications because we kept that center line in. And you also notice that I stayed about a 1/4 inch or so or more away from the transition areas. Okay, the transition areas are very critical. Now we can take very sharp knives and we can carve that out, and that's probably the easiest way to get it, but if your knives aren't perfectly sharp, you could chip it out, and then you've got a problem if you chip out beyond. So I like to take, for these transition areas, and I like to either grind them down with the file, the dragon rasp, the one that's got the curved edge, and I begin kind of working that in and working up to my line and creating the contour to match what I just did on the neck, but not exceeding the line, taking it as close as I can to that line without going over. Remember, we gave ourselves a 1/4 inch extra buffer, so if we do cross it ever so slightly, we're not going to ruin the neck, but stop before you go any further. Don't try to make a bad thing worse. So stop at the line. If you cross the line, do no more with files and rasps or grinders or anything like that, and just use sandpaper to kind of work it all out. One of the most important things is to take a straight edge. This is 6 inches, 6 to 10 inches is fine. And you want to double check your work by looking and make sure that you've stayed flat. If you find a hump somewhere, like right now, I see there's a hump right here. That's just an area that I've got to come back and work a little harder at. Now, if you've got a carving background, or you're just more on the adventurous side, you may want to try something like this. This is a little carving tool. All right, so when we're working with this, remember, you got to take it easy because the faster you remove wood, the faster you can make a mistake. Now's the time to break out some sanding tools. So I like this. I like a little, like 1 inch pad. It actually comes from a spindle sander, but that I can work in and get these contours out nicely. And I can begin to blend all of that together, keeping track of, of where I want to be as far as not getting too far off the lines yet. If your contour is a little smaller, sometimes these little rubber contour pads are nice. You can get in there and work it. Sometimes the flat area of these are really nice too. Put that on there and work into the blending of that transition area. This is one of my absolute favorite tools. It's a 1-inch piece of MDF that I just kind of took a slice about a 1/2 inch thick. I rounded the edges, so I've got one piece of sandpaper that goes to tight corners. I've got the other side that's going to a radius for sanding, the other side with a radius with no sandpaper, so when I want to work into the radius but not take anything away from the radius. But the nice thing is, this is about 9 inches long, is I can begin working laterally back and forth, and I'm ensuring that the neck is staying flat. And I can really take my ruler out and I can focus on making sure that stays flat the entire way, and that is, honestly, that's right there. So I'll work on getting all the file scratches out with this 80 grit, and I'm keeping my center line, but at this point I'm going to start blending in a little bit to the fretboard, taking it all the way down to the fretboard as I work back and forth and forward and aft. And then I'll blend in those transition areas one other time. If I had both sides of this neck shaped, then what I would do is work this in unison. A little bit on one side, a little bit on the other side, ensuring that I stay flat the entire time. And then I would up the sandpaper from 80 grit to 120 to 180 to 240, and probably stop there, at least for now. I may go a little bit higher prior to finishing, but stop there now. But I am all the way up to that line. And this is where double checking, if you had both sides done, where you could do this and then flip it around and double check the other side is the same, that's where that would come into handy. But obviously we're not going to be at that point because we only have one side done. But this is the beginning part right here. All right, did you see enough close-ups to kind of get a feel for what I'm doing and the tools that I'm using and the procedures which I'm going at? Again, this is very elementary. If you've already done 100 guitars, you don't need this video to help you out. But if you're just getting into this and you don't want to buy a neck already done and just try to fit it into a body, then what you should be doing is building your own neck and then take and make a neck pocket to fit the neck on the body, and that is the easiest way to do it. Now, I've only done half to conserve time, and I'm going to do the other half off camera, and I'm going to come back and show you, but I do want to show you where I'm at right now and talk about it a little bit. The most important thing about a neck is not what you can see, but what you can feel. And once you get both sides done, you'll understand what I mean, but I can begin to work my hand along this neck right now and the thumb, and I can feel any nuance there. Don't even look at it, okay? Because if you look at it, your eyes are going to begin to fool you and thinking, oh yeah, I don't think I really feel that. Yeah, I can't see it, so it must not be there. If your hand can feel it, it's there. And right now, I've got a pretty smooth transition on this curve, and I'm liking it a lot. The only place I've got a hard line where my thumb can feel kind of a definitive line of change of that arc is right where the fretboard joins. Now, some people prefer to keep the fretboard perfectly square and stop at that point. I go further, but I don't do it with 80 grit. I do it more at the 120 to 180 grit area, and I will begin to blend those in so that my thumb can't feel any transition from the fretboard all the way to the center of the neck. And I do that on both sides. And I stop sanding when I get to the point where I like the shape and I can't feel any definitive changes in angle. That is a smooth transition. That will be a good feeling neck. So let's look close one more time. I'm right up to my line right there. I've got some more to take off in the center section, but what I really wanted to focus on was the transition, how it comes down and bends around and flows perfectly in. The most critical point is right at the bottom of that transition area. You don't want to scoop it out and be lower than the contour of the neck. That is the most common mistake. And the same thing on this side. It flows right up to my center line. There'll be more contouring. When I remove the center line, it'll just be very light sanding to kind of blend it all together. But this transition area blends. It follows the lines that I had laid out, at least on one half of it, and it comes in and flows all the way there with only a little bit more to remove down by the fretboard. That's hard work. It really is, but it can be enjoyable, and it can be satisfying, certainly. And if you take your time and you do it right, you can have a really great playing guitar, which is really what it's all about, isn't it? I'm going to finish the other half, and I'm going to come back, maybe even sneak in a little lunch before then, and show you what I've come up with. All right, now we've got the other side done, and I've kind of checked it out, and I really am pretty happy with the symmetry. I've been checking it out with our little contour gauge, and I basically pick an area, for instance, the first fret area, and I'll press it down, I'll flip it around, and I'll get back to the first fret area, and I'll look and I'll make sure that that touches the same when I flip it around as I did the first time. That tells me I have symmetry, and if it gaps on one side, that means I have a high spot on the other side, and I work it down a little bit. And that's what I did. Same thing down here at the 12th fret. If we look at that, and we flip it around, it's right there. Okay, it's looking really good. We got great symmetry. Now I left the center line that I radiused, or contoured I should say, the back of these sides, but I have not touched the center line. So if we look at this, and we followed it all the way from transition area to transition area, you can still see the faint area of that center line the entire way. That is what we want to happen. What does that guarantee me again? That guarantees me that the taper that I put on the drill press with the safety planer, I have kept intact the entire time, so I don't have the back of my neck doing this wave. All right, that is a critical part. Now I do have a ridge on the top because I didn't take anything off. So now that you've seen that, I can take my custom MDF sanding tool and I can begin now blending the entire ridge in there and bringing that around. I can also use the sandpaper technique where you just get a piece and you just kind of work it, keeping the similar number of strokes as you go, because now that we're removing the line, we want to make sure that we don't change the flatness. So we just keep working all the way down and blending all of those areas together. We are almost there. Again, double check with the straight edge. We want to make sure it is flat all the way down and on the sides all the way up to the transition areas. I'm going to keep working this a little bit longer. I'm going to step it up to 120, 1.8. We're going to finish up around 220 grit, and we will be at a point that we're finished working for today. But I'm going to go ahead and do that and show you what we come up with when we're all done working through progressively through the different grits. All right, wrapping up this episode here. I got my friendly neighborhood naphtha, good cleaner, but also helps simulate a clear finish on this neck. And I want you all to see this because it's pretty sexy, if I do say so myself. Well, check this out. The naphtha evaporates pretty quick. So let's get a look at the beauty and the symmetry of this neck. in the transition areas. Steep, yet distinct. I have people contacting me a lot of times asking me, hey, will you make me that neck contouring jig that I saw the video of? Will you make that for me? And I have it. I've never said yes. I haven't even made plans because when I made it, I didn't really make it from CAD. I just kind of hand drew it and built it and kind of tweaked it as I went in order to make it work. But I'm telling you, a lot of people that ask me that haven't even built their first guitar neck yet, and they're asking me to build that so that they don't have to carve it by hand. And I think it's because they're afraid of messing up. And I just want to encourage you that this is a very important skill. If you're going to make one guitar, if you're going to make 100 guitars, this is a very important skill to be able to do this by hand with hand tools and gauge it with your hands and feel that there's perfection here in a sense that there's no ridges or humps. It's perfectly smooth and everything's transitional and it just feels right to a player's hand. And if you mess up, you mess up. Okay, don't expect to get this beautiful piece of curly maple and make this neck on the very first try. It's unrealistic expectation. Take a cheaper piece of wood, maybe one that's easier to machine and work with than maple, and try it out. And if you succeed, then try something a little nicer and work your way up to that. And that way you'll avoid major disappointment and then possibly losing, an interest in guitar making. So I would really encourage you. This neck is beautiful. It was done all by hand throughout the entire process. I showed you most of it, but everything happened that exact same way. And it is just going to be a killer neck to go with whatever body that I'm going to put it on. That is a deep dive into neck contouring. And to me, honestly, this is the right way to do it by hand. If you're not going to use machines, if you're not going to use a CNC, this is the way to do it, in my opinion. So until the next episode, remember, no matter what you do, start with excellence.